Hmm. Looks a little lonely over there.
Oh, whoops. Right. Where's the phone going? Right, that works. Right, are you ready to kick off? Thank you everyone, and I'll just make a few introductory remarks before I hand over to the real experts. But just a sort of reminder of the challenge in front of us. So obviously we went through COP26, collective, historic, really great, proud to be British in terms of what we managed to achieve there, and it gave us the Glasgow Climate Pact. And that gave us the challenge for the next 10 years being the decade of climate action. Less talk, more doing. And in short, now we got to work out how we deliver on the promises that were made. Very appropriate UK here in UAE in terms of that road to net zero, because I think we both as countries are determined to pave the way to that sustainable future. So in 2019, the UK were the first major economy to pass legislation to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050, and whilst at the same time continuing to grow our economy. And in October last year, the UAE became the first nation in the region and the first major oil producer to make the same kind of commitment. So we're both on the same path, both committed to putting clean growth at the heart of our plans. We've obviously got an exciting period coming up, which segues again very nicely with Egypt hosting COP27 in November and UAE hosting COP28 next year. So it's an opportunity for us to work together with our friends and partners on that challenge of seeing the Glasgow commitments turned into tangible action. One thing that's become really clear to me is just how important partnership and cooperation are to meeting that challenge and indeed reaching back to the Paris Agreement goals. And today is an opportunity, and I had a dinner last night touching on the same thing, to look at the importance of science, academics and civil society. Collaboration is the key. We need to reach across divides. We need to integrate science, policy. Actually, I'd add to that innovation, business, activists as well. And we need the best available evidence, and that scientific basis to what we do needs to be very clear. As, and I'd add to my speaking notes, I also think speaking the same language, having the same standards, understanding what we mean by things so that we can get behind the polemic and the sort of criticism of what's happened in the past and really concentrate on having a clear agenda for the future and really clear understanding of what is and is not contributing and what does or does not represent progress. So the Future We Want project here today looked at the forecasted impacts of climate change on the Arabian Peninsula as well as 5 other regions in the world, and presented those to governments, civil society, business and young people, and asked them to imagine what future they hoped for. And core to that was that science, academics, experts and civil societies need to work together to innovate and educate to reach that sustainable future. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panel about the work they're doing to shape that net zero, healthier, more livable, more prosperous, yet sustainable world. And God knows, in the wider circumstances we live in, this is a challenge we've identified. This is a challenge we can achieve. So it's really great to be here with the people who are at the heart of that. So Janet, I hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for kicking us off today and starting us down the road of a discussion this afternoon with, I think, some quite good guidance in there that we need to be talking the same language. So I'm going to challenge our panel when we come to it to jargon bust and translate for the wider audience all of the very interesting elements, and I know they're interesting because we've already been through them, that we're going to discuss today. Can we get up on the screen our other colleagues who are joining, so I can just do the introductions? Is that possible to see them? Yes, there we go. Fantastic. So just a couple of words about the session today. As Patrick said, this is about the futures we want. And the role of science and innovation was a key theme at COP26. And this Futures We Want program was one of 3 flagship COP26 science programs. And the aim was to try to support a better negotiated outcome at COP26 by really talking about mitigation, adaptation, and resilience from the perspective of solutions. And I think we all know that some of the technological solutions that are coming forward to meet the climate challenges are actually also solutions that we can use as part of our wider policy making in terms of making progress across the piece. So in fact, I've written in my notes here, science, innovation, and collaboration are key to unlocking the pathway to a sustainable future. And it's important to remember that sustainable element is both in terms of green and the wider green agenda, if I can put it like that in short, but also the sustainability of progress. We want transformative progress, which means change that enables another change and doesn't change back. So in that sense, we want to be moving forward and making progress. So we have a great panel here today, and I'm briefly going to introduce them so that they don't have to use up their valuable time in the panels to do that themselves. I will just quickly run through the bios here in the order in which they come. So we have with us Dr. Lata Sahonta from the University of Cambridge. She's joining us online. Hi, Lata, can you hear me? And we can see you? Good, excellent. Dr. Lata Sahonta is the manager of Cambridge University's Interdisciplinary Research Centre on Energy, which supports around 200 Cambridge academics conducting research into the permanent global energy transition away from fossil fuels. We then also have Professor Ludovic Dumais, Ludo, from Khalifa University, who is a specialist, actually he's a multidisciplinary engineer interested in the development and application of advanced responsive materials for chemicals remediation and separation. I'm sure he's going to explain what the relevance of that is to our specific topic as we get through today. But more importantly now, he currently works as an assistant professor of separation materials within the chemical engineering department of Khalifa University. He also covers CO2 and hydrogen, which always sound like something from science fiction. So let's hope we hear today about how that's relevant to the futures that we want. We also have Professor Adrian Fisher from the University of Cambridge also. Adrian founded the Centre for Research in Electrochemical Science and Technology in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology in 2003. And since that time, the centre has expanded to establish laboratories in Singapore and in Beijing. So we're seeing a cross-regional approach here, which will actually be very important as we move forward, even into COP28, which is the COP for Asia. So that will be a good follow-through. And Adrian's research is focused on energy transition and the technologies that will contribute to future low-carbon chemical manufacturing approaches using electrolysis, and of which I see is a very prolific publisher with more than 200 academic papers in journals. I think that's really probably worthy of a round of applause in itself. We also have online joining us Professor Joseph Howe. Professor Joe is at the University of Chester. He is the Executive Director of the Chester Energy Institute and has extensive experience in working interchangeably with industry on major environmental projects and initiatives across the UK. And I would note there the interchangeable with industry. Research in this field is really looking very much now at solutions that can be implemented, and therefore finding those good partnerships is really important. His background is in geography, environmental engineering and science, and he's a leading commentator on industrial decarbonization, which is also going to be one of the elements we look at today. And then we have Dr. Alejandro Rios Galvan, who is also at Khalifa University. He is very much focused on the sustainable aviation fuel industry, looking at locally viable pathways, including power to liquids and synthetic fuels. This is one of the trickiest elements, probably, as we think about going forward in reducing emissions in terms of our lifestyles. So it's very, very important. Alejandro is the director of the Sustainable Bioenergy Research Consortium at Khalifa University, and he has also very practically overseen the operation and management of a network of 60 fuel farms, and there are almost more than 2,000 interplane operations. This is really a very practical approach too. And finally, to put at ends of both ends of our panels are lady members. We have Professor Susan Crumdek from Heriot-Watt University. Susan is a professor in mechanical engineering and chair in energy transition engineering at Heriot-Watt University. She has more than 30 years of experience in energy systems engineering, including renewable energy. So she's very front end of this. And end-use demand participation, transportation, and research engineering in hydrogen and carbon capture systems. So bringing that very much up to the moment and up to date. So having introduced all of our panel members, what we're going to do today is have each of them give us a roughly 5 to 7 minute introduction into their areas and the points in particular that they want to share with us, because otherwise we could have 5 hours of lectures from each of them on the subject of the futures we want. And then I will ask each of them some questions following up on that. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers from anybody in the room. And I'm not sure if we can take questions online, but anyway, if we have any, we'll manage those. And then wrap it up at the end after a couple of hours. So I'm going to ask everybody to be really focused on their 5 to 7 minutes. And hopefully somebody will give me a signal when the 5 to 7 minutes are coming up. I don't see, we haven't got a countdown clock on the thing here, but we'll do our best. So I'm going to start with Dr. Lata Sahonta at the University of Cambridge. Can we hand over to you for your presentation, please?
Good afternoon from a very cold, rainy Cambridge. I wish to be there with you in person at this site panel today. I hope that we have some lively and enlightening discussion today. So just to introduce myself, I'm Lata. I'm the manager of the University of Cambridge's Energy Centre, and my job is to facilitate academic industry engagement and also engagement with government and international organisations to collaborate with the University of Cambridge towards a net zero future. I'm going to set the scene today by talking about the Futures We Want project. So this was funded by the UK's, the government's Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in 2021. It was set up just before COP26 in Glasgow, with the goal to present a standardised set of country, techno-economic and climate profiles as an evidence base for policy towards a global net zero. As part of this project, Cambridge led on the delivery of a set of 6 country and regional profiles, which set out the available evidence base on regional challenges and opportunities for climate change, mitigation, adaptation and resilience measures. The development of these profiles was driven by input from academic experts in each of the respective countries and regions. So the countries and regions themselves were the UK, India, Brazil, Jamaica, Kenya, and the Arabian Peninsula region, represented by KSA and UAE together. And all of these studies spanned a very broad range of current developmental status for each nation or region, the greenhouse gas emissions, climate vulnerability, risk related to water. And so there were numerous variables which were explored during these profiles. We appreciate that the future climate policy trajectories for KSA and UAE will differ, yet there were a number of very interesting common threads which emerged from the analysis. The Futures We Want project is an exemplar of how university, business and government can collaborate together to produce a solid evidence base for facilitated discussions during COP27 in Egypt in November and also for COP28 in UAE. With that, I'm going to finish my introduction. I'm looking forward to discussing a little bit more about the mechanics of the project, and I will hand you over to the next members of the panel.
Thank you very much also for giving us a minute or so back. I know we've got a lot of things to go through, but thank you for the introduction as well, to bring us into the idea of the futures we want, and also from that perspective of facilitating exactly that kind of work. I'm going to hand over now to Ludo to give the next presentation. I think you have a presentation?
Yeah, a few slides. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. My name is, oh, sorry. No. Sorry, the slides are missing. Okay, that's all right. Just checking the purpose. Okay, it's okay. So yeah, my name is Ludo. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering in Khalifa University. I work across two different research centers, one focused on CO2 capture, utilization, and hydrogen production and transport, the REACH Center. And the second center, which is the CMAT, the Center for Membrane and Advanced Water Technologies. So we are covering a broad, I would say, range of fields there in that case. And obviously, we are interested into looking at sustainable water production, the food, energy, water circle, I would say, and also integrating technologies to decarbonize energy production and to see how we can support locally the government and the policy of the country to move towards the hydrogen economy, which was decided very recently last year as a roadmap for 2050. So part of our activities are related to engagement, obviously, first to train the engineers of tomorrow. So you were talking about science fiction before, and I was watching Star Wars Episode 8 last night, in fact, my kids, and I was wondering what fuel do they use, you know, to manage all they do down there, anyway. And I'm not sure what they do, but I think we can keep working towards a direction to try to be more sustainable and obviously to have less impact on the environment, per se. So part of our mission we have across these two centers is to actively engage through the training of the next generation of engineers, trying to make sure we can deliver for the local industry, and we have a number of international industry partners with whom we do demonstrations for the country, and also doing our best to develop, while we do these demonstrations, the next generation of technologies to, again, support these two pillars on water and energy. So in very short, I would like to introduce a few things we are doing in the water space. The first one is, and part of the idea to look at maybe what features we want there, is to try to see if we can move from a very centralized water production system to a rather more decentralized production scheme. And there are benefits and drawbacks by doing so. Some of the benefits for the UAE especially is to be able to produce water in desertic environments, to actually produce the water down in the desert, as opposed to having to bring the water from the coast to the inland. That's the first one. And we are developing technologies and implementing them through a number of processes. But one of them is actually atmospheric water generation, which is also led by Dr. Samuel Mao in the audience here today. The other one which I want to mention is obviously the roadmap that the government has put together for hydrogen across the country. And we have potentially different approaches depending on the Emirates. So Abu Dhabi is looking at more a blue hydrogen. So I had a very nice slide with some colors and rainbows. So I won't show it to you today, but anyway, maybe another time. That approach is looking at utilizing methane and converting methane to hydrogen and seeing how we can utilize the CO2 as a block to do further chemistry, or otherwise to store it underground. So there are different strategies implemented, which I think have value and need to be considered. For Dubai, the strategy is a bit different. The green hydrogen is more on the table, so obviously water splitting, and that involves obviously producing water at a high enough quality, which is pretty much deionized, like you would have after reverse osmosis or distillation, to feed the electrolyzers. So again, we produce water here because it's very, thank you. Thank you so much, Leila. Okay, so we'll skip that, but yeah, I had those slides about water, food, energy schemes there. Yeah, I'll do very quick. About the different colors of hydrogen per se, and the ones we are focusing on for water hydrolysis, and obviously steam reforming with CCS, carbon capture and storage. And this was about the aspect for the traditional linear water model compared to the more diversified and decentralized water strategy, which we try to implement through these projects. Another thing we are very interested into is resource recovery and resource valorization from waste. Obviously from brines, from desalination, but using CO2 or other gases like H2S produced from the gas field as well to generate potentially further hydrogen or otherwise valuable sources. On this, these are just my takeaway messages, and I think there are many more we could discuss, but what I want to say is that obviously we try to implement we need to implement strong government policies to enable these strategies. We need to look at how we can manage emissions, because it's not only about hydrogen per se, it's about what comes around hydrogen, and do we have the right technologies, do we have the right energy from a renewable point of view to manage this? And also, is it worth considering decentralized systems for energy and water production per se? And I will stop here. So thank you so much for your time, and apologies for the technical glitch.
Well done. That was a brilliant run through, and I took a couple of things from that just as the next, as Adrian is getting ready for his. On actually, one of the points is that there's no such thing as waste. In fact, if we have the technologies right, you can actually use the waste, you can be recovering it, and you can make something else useful from it. So there's as we always say, there's cash in trash. So if I now hand over to Adrian, if you're ready. Thank you very much. Take us further on our journey.
Okay, so I wanted to move on and look at what's called the hydrogen economy, something we've sort of already heard of, I think. And that's really been around for around 50 years. We've been thinking about this as an idea, as a concept. And actually, hydrogen itself is used in the economy already to a great extent. It's a very large CO2 emitter. Mainly used in the chemical industry. We produce fertilizers through reactions of hydrogen with ammonia. We produce hydrogen for general hydrogenation reactions in society for plastics and things like this. So that hydrogen as a product that's being produced is already important to us. And currently, hydrogen is produced historically through rather unclean processes, but in the future it's looking like we can produce it in ways which are non-polluting, much less polluting. So the vision now is to take hydrogen as something that's already used and is already an infrastructure to produce it, and transition it to one that's much more sustainable and practical. And along that path, it may be that we can use hydrogen for other aspects of our society that we don't use it at the moment. For example, it could be used in transportation. We could use a fuel cell to take hydrogen and oxygen, produce electricity, a drivetrain which then allows the car to move, and it produces water as a chemical product. So we already have a great need for hydrogen, and we can also see that hydrogen can be used in a broader way in the future. And so the question is, how do you go about transitioning hydrogen from what is a relatively high carbon dioxide emitting process to one that is low carbon? And ultimately, we expect what will happen is we'll take renewable electricity, and we will use that electricity directly to split water into its components, hydrogen and oxygen. Now, this is inherently a clean process, providing we have clean electrons, i.e. electrons which come from a renewable source, and a water supply that isn't competing with other needs. So ideally would be a salt water supply and electricity coming from renewable sources. But we don't have to start there, but that is likely to be the ultimate transition to production of hydrogen. In the path in between, we had a color-coded slide a minute ago that there's various colors of hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is something you probably hear quite a lot about at the moment, and that's an intermediary process. It's one where we use some existing technologies, but we capture some of the emissions associated with that hydrogen, so it's cleaner than if we just took it from a fossil fuel to start with. So hydrogen itself is used substantially. It's not just used in chemical industry, it's used in heating and many other applications. So it's already very much in our sort of industrial sector, and it's a case of transitioning it to something that's more clean and sustainable. And it sort of fits into this electrification of everything sort of theme that we're beginning to see. We see society moving to electrification through its cars, for example, and historically through things like transportation for train infrastructure. We can also see that electrification happening for chemical industry. We can directly manufacture chemicals electrically. And so this will become a bigger and bigger theme as industry starts to try and decarbonize. Industrial production is a very substantial part of carbon dioxide emissions. And it's a very hard to abate sector. It's not something we know the answer to. What we do know at the moment is transportation. We probably have an approximate roadmap of where we start and where we end up. Okay, not exactly, but we have a fairly good understanding of what the technologies are likely to be, when they'll be economically viable, and governments are already imposing. A car in the UK is 2030, we cannot buy a car without an electrical drivetrain. The chemical industry, the transformation there is really poorly understood, and it is a substantial emitter of CO2. And so we've got to start looking at these concepts and these ideas now, because a typical investment cycle for chemical industry is around 20 years. It takes 20 years to get an investment cycle return on a chemical plant. So whilst 2050 seems like a reasonably distant prospect, we've got to start making those changes by 2030 if we're to actually make an impact from the industrial side. So many challenges, and we are in some ways stuck in the sense that we don't necessarily know what the pathway forward is. The hydrogen, however, is perhaps one of the more advanced. There's been a lot of thinking about it over many years, and also the hydrogen approach of how we can deal with it and produce it in a cleaner way is pretty well defined. So this is a rather interesting roadmap because it helps us to think about other chemical processes that we may also need to transition. And so, as I said, the idea is we use renewable electricity to actually split water, ultimately, to make a clean and sustainable source of hydrogen. But the path between that and the ultimate sort of implementation of hydrogen production is less clear. Right? We've still got plenty to do in between. And so I think it was made very clear earlier the importance of international collaboration, and actually this research and the projects that we're talking about today are part of an international collaboration that Cambridge has with Singapore. And Cambridge set up a research centre in Singapore, which I was very fortunate to be one of the team to establish. And over the decade that this project's run, we've built up immense partnerships and networks in Singapore and throughout the Asia region to understand much more regionally what's important in terms of carbon capture and low carbon technologies. And so these international symposia and things like this are really critical because each society has quite different changes that need to be made. The energy transition for one country won't be the same as the energy transition to another. The technology base will be important, but it will be different and it will be implemented in different ways. And so we can only really achieve a global low carbon economy by strong collaborations in international partnerships. So I thought I might leave my talk at that point.
Well done. Thank you very much. Thank you. And just as we're going to go back online now to hear from Professor Joseph Rowe, but just as he's coming up, there's a similarities there between hydrogen, which is already being produced, but by a less than clean, perhaps or not as clean as it could be processed, just like hydrocarbons, where the process can be cleaned up a lot, the products can be cleaned up a lot and turned into different uses. But at the same time, there are other elements that come along with reducing emissions, which are carbon capture and storage. And I think we're going to get a presentation on that now from Professor Joe. So over to you.
Many thanks for the kind introduction. If someone could operate the slide back, please, that would be much appreciated.
Yep, it's going.
That's absolutely fabulous. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Adrian for the previous talk. It set me up quite well in relation to both hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, etc. The UK government over the last 2 to 3 years has challenged industry with this industrial decarbonisation challenge. Underneath that, there are 3 different themes. It's identified the key industrial clusters around the UK and is actively supporting them within industrial demonstrators. It's supporting each of the industrial clusters with cluster plans to map out industrial transformation between now and 2050. And it's also established a science and innovation centre called the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, which I'm a co-investigator of, and that's what the primary focus of my talk will be today. Next slide, please. On this particular slide, I articulate what the industrial decarbonisation challenge is. It clearly identifies a number of different themes which Adrian and the other speakers have already begun to allude to. Renewable energy, carbon capture utilisation, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, the relationship between hydrogen and ammonia as well. Some key themes there that will come across time after time. One of the things that we'd like to reach out to colleagues in the Middle East and North Africa about is that science, innovation, collaboration opportunities around these particular themes. Next slide, please. This slide shows you the size of the industrial clusters within the UK. Roughly, approximately, responsible for 10% of UK's emissions. And industry in the UK per se is responsible for just over a quarter of UK's emissions. So that's why the government is prioritising industry in terms of a hopefully fairly quick win solution to some of the major challenges around the UK, with some of these being operational by 2030. Next slide, please. These are all of the clusters with all of the key industrial bodies engaged with the different clusters and how they're beginning to collaborate to look at the various initiatives that need to be put in place that are being operationalised and with science innovation provided by the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre. Next slide, please. So IDRIC, the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, 3 different themes there: technology, policy, business models coming across quite powerfully, skills, and one of the things that Janet alluded to at the very start, collaboration, the pressing need for industry to collaborate with government, to collaborate with communities, to come up with solutions to address what is the ecological and climate emergency that we all face in the Middle East, in North Africa, and the rest of the world. Next slide, please. So one of the key issues for us is the notion of collaborations at pace. And so working together to address these particular challenges, to reduce costs, to try and mitigate against emissions, to come up with policies and to accelerate policies in various economies and economics to deliver on industrial decarbonisation. Next slide, please. So, sorry, next slide, please. So the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, I see this as being world leading in terms of what it's trying to address. It's absolutely high profile with the UK government. You'll see on the left-hand side of this slide, I think it's on the left-hand side as you look at it, 3 key policy documents that have been identified by government which mentions the industrial decarbonisation grand challenge. The profile it has with industry, the profile it has with government, and the profile it has in academia. Next slide, please. Within IDRIC, if you could keep going down, you'll see that there are 9 multidisciplinary programs. So if you could go down, please, on that. There are 9 multidisciplinary programs which you can see as on that particular slide. I'm very much involved in the skills working group, looking at skills and workforce planning for industrial decarbonisation, and also looking at supply chain and supply chain capacity within the UK around this, where there are potentially gaps, where we might need to import skills, where we might have the opportunities to export skills, science and innovation, etc. Next slide, please. So what do? We are providing regular briefings to policymakers, to government, to industry, to communities, to academia about what Adrian outlined before as being quite a challenging sector, industry, and how do we collaborate with these industries. IDRIC is becoming a core hub for those collaborations, but equally IDRIC is feeding out and is exchanging knowledge to those key bodies that will be so important in this agenda. Next slide, please. Adrian also talked about the hydrogen agenda. I'm very much involved in that. The Northwest Hydrogen Alliance is something that I chair. It brings together 30 different companies, molecule producers, distributors, consumers, innovators, skills providers. Left-hand side of the slide. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see the HyNet geography. The HyNet is one of the one of two key clusters that has been identified by government to be operational with carbon capture and storage by 2025. That's 3 years' time. They will be operational, capturing a lot of carbon emissions from industry, utilising offshore oil and gas fields for the storage of that carbon. But also within the Northwest, we have the largest carbon capture and utilisation facility in the UK at Tata Chemicals. Next slide, please. So my final message for you, or my final message is, IDRIC is world leading. It's a first port of call for anyone that wants to know things about industrial decarbonisation. We are producing a lot of briefings, and I would encourage people to look at that. Colleagues, we are in a climate and ecological emergency, and there's a pressing need for science, innovation, collaboration to address those particular issues, to collaborate at pace because of that ecological and climate emergency. But also, colleagues, particularly for colleagues in the Middle East and North Africa, I see this as being a wonderful opportunity for investment. Investment both ways. Investment in terms of intellectual capability, but also potentially investment in terms of skills and financial capacity as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's really showing in a very practical way and demonstrating the complexity of how the interactions between science, technology, research, development and implementation actually play out in the real world and where the potentials are. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Alejandro Rios Galvan, and we're going to come down a little bit and focus on one sector, which is sustainable aviation fuel, and look at and do a little bit of a dive into that one. Please, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind invitation to be here today. I'll be briefing you a little bit on the work that we're doing in terms of trying to decarbonize the aviation sector, which is one of the hard to decarbonize sectors in our economy. Aviation, as you might assume, flies with a liquid hydrocarbon fuel, and that technology will not change for the foreseeable future. Yes, there is work being done on electric flight, but electric planes will probably fly for 100, 200 kilometers for 6 to 8 passengers in the mid-term. And so that is a reality that will be part of our future. But if we want to fly for thousands of kilometers, hundreds of passengers, the technology for the next 50 or so years will not change that much. So we will need a liquid hydrocarbon fuel to do that. And there are only so many ways we can produce a liquid hydrocarbon fuel. And so we need to work together, we need to collaborate, and we need to take into account many different actors and stakeholders to be able to do that. I'll very briefly give you a sense of what is happening here. The UAE is ranked 3rd in the world in terms of its aviation market, only behind the United States and China. And if you think about what that means, the United States is obviously the most or the biggest economy in the world. China is the most populous country in the world. And the UAE is ranked 3rd both in terms of revenue ton kilometers and revenue passenger kilometers, only behind those two countries. And so what that means is that the market, the aviation market that the UAE manages is extremely big. And that is because the UAE is a hub. They move passengers from Europe, from the United States, to the east, to the Far East, to Southeast Asia, to Australia. And so that type of movement brings a lot of passengers here. Dubai is the largest international airport in the world. It is the airport that handles the most international passengers, and it is the third largest in terms of passengers worldwide. So if we look at, how much money has been invested by the UAE into its aviation sector, we have one of the newest fleets in the world. Most of the two major carriers here, Etihad Airways and Emirates Airline, both have a significant investment in very new aircraft. And so what you can see is that they're very efficient aircraft because they're newer aircraft, but they still have a significant footprint. In terms of what that means, there are models that have been run, and it indicates that the UAE is ranked sixth worldwide in terms of CO2 emissions from its aviation sector. So we have to invest in making sure that we can fly sustainably and we can reduce the carbon footprint from the aviation sector in this country. There are other very important items to consider in this, and that is that the UAE is a country that sits in a region that is water scarce. There's no fresh water here, and there's no arable land. So the possibility to produce sustainable aviation fuel from bio resources is very limited. We have been working for many years in developing technology for growing halophyte plants using desert sand and seawater, and that technology is moving along, but it will take some time for us to be able to reach scale and to be able to produce significant amounts of oil from these types of plants. I, for one, hope that we will get there at some point in time, but we need to consider other types of feedstocks and other types of resources that are already present here. And by that I mean the industrial sector that is already working here. The UAE has invested and has pledged to invest a significant amount of resources in developing the hydrogen economy. And so hydrogen, as my colleagues have already said, will play a major role in the development of synthetic fuels and in the development of power to liquids, which is to take electricity, as Adrian and Ludo were explaining, and low carbon intensity electricity to split water so that we can produce hydrogen, and then take carbon capture technology and then combine the hydrogen, the low carbon intensity hydrogen, with the captured carbon into a synthetic gas. And that synthetic gas can then be converted into a liquid hydrocarbon fuel. So that is part of the future that we want to see, and that is what we will see in this region of the world. This is just a schematic of what I just explained to you. There are many pathways that can be considered technology pathways, and there are different ways in which we can convert industrial gases into liquid hydrocarbon fuels. Clearly, these technologies are not cheap, but they are a way in which we can reduce the carbon footprint. And so there's a balance, we need to strike the right type of balance in between being able to reduce the carbon footprint and also having a license to fly sustainably. And so with that, we are doing research on a number of things. We need to do research on feedstocks, on pathways and processes that can be done for producing these synthetic fuels and the power to liquids pathway. We need to make sure that we're able to certify these fuels from an environmental and sustainability perspective. We need to make sure that we have the understanding of these fuels being complying with the technical performance and safety standards that exist for the aviation industry. We also need to make sure that these fuels, as I was mentioning to you, are price competitive with the fuels that we use today, and for that, policy will be a central item that we need to consider. And so with that, I will leave it for, I guess, our further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think that presentation, thank you, Alejandro, really shows us the importance of well-synthesized data and analysis for decision-making and policy-making, showing the complexity of those pathways and the lead time that is required, as others have talked to, really was well explained there. there's also a question of trust, and there's a question of how this, coming from a scientific and a private sector perspective, combined with government, can also be understood and related to by communities and by the wider population. And Susan, if I want to bring you in to talk about the just energy transition and how those different elements play out.
All right, thanks. I'm an engineer, and very early in my career, I invented something. Do we have any other innovators here? Somebody who's invented something. Oh, if you do the buzz, you become addicted to it, and you set yourself out. I want to be an innovator, right? So there's 3 ingredients to being an innovator if you want to do it. Number 1 is you have to actually be an expert in the thing that you're working on. You can't innovate from a black hole. All right, so number 1, you have to be an expert. Number 2 is a little weird because you have to admit that all the ways you thought you could do that aren't going to work. There isn't a way to do it. You can't innovate if there's already a way to do it. Just do what would work. And the 3rd ingredient is that you have to say this to yourself. Oh, we're on the wrong one. Oh, thank you. You have to say this to yourself. What if we looked at it a different way? Right? Because you can't just keep going down the same road you have. So if you want to innovate, and it doesn't have to be just technologies at all, social, how to get your kid to go to bed, yeah, innovate. All right. So what I want to talk about is in this context of looking forward and thinking, okay, what are we going to do? Learn stuff, admit when things aren't going to work when you hoped they would, and say, okay, what if we looked at this a different way? So that's what we're going to do. Let's look at science as a requirement. All right. So a few years ago, I was trying to explain to undergraduates about accumulating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you all know that back in the 90s, we agreed that it wouldn't be safe to go above 350 parts per million. Or did we say safe? Was that the thing we missed out on? We said we shouldn't, but it wasn't actually safe. The climate's going to change if we go above 350 parts per million. And now in the 5th assessment report, they're saying hair on fire, right? Something's really, really wrong. We have to change things. And so I started thinking, okay, how do I explain this? And in engineering terms, it would be called a failure limit. Don't do that. Don't load to failure. And so what I've done is I've taken the Mauna Loa data for the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, just the measurement, and I've changed the curve with something happening now, some innovation clearly, because that it would be different if we changed the curve and we didn't go near 1.5 degrees. So you've seen this curve before? Have you seen it not going above 1.5 degrees? Because that's the job. Well, that seems to explain it. And the students are, oh, pretty happy with that. Let's do that then. That makes sense. Okay, now get an Excel spreadsheet and put the global fossil fuel use into the spreadsheet and make that curve do that. And this is what that looks like. And it's pretty weird. Like, what does this even mean? That we talk about emissions a lot, and we talk about how we're going to bring down emissions, when in fact any carbon that comes out of the air and is burned as fuel and goes into the air, or comes out of the ground and goes into the air, adds to the accumulation. And so the fuel production rate has to go down. And this is from the IPCC report. It's in there, maybe not plotted like that, but maybe you guys have seen this plot recently. And it's really a bit shocking because you check your numbers, like what's going on? And it's all about, do you want to get there, right? What future do you want? Do you want the one where there's a 3% chance that we're not going to load to failure, or an 80% chance? And what you'll see here, if you can see the dates, is that it's not about a thing that happens in 2050 at all. It's about a thing that happens now. Okay, what's that thing? Have we already got the solution, or maybe we don't have one? Therefore, we get to innovate. Oh, that's what I wanted to do anyway. So the things that we know is that policy has to be involved, that science has to be involved, that community has to be involved, and that what about community is the well-being, the values, those sorts of things. So what I think we're actually missing a little bit is the third leg. And that third leg is engineering. Why? Because that's how all that carbon's getting in the air. And the engineers have to be involved in changing the good, legal, compliant, safe, economical, technical enterprise that they have purview over. They're the experts in it. You want to change it, you got to get them into this game. All right. And so that's what we call transition engineering. I'm a professor at Heriot-Watt, and I'm setting up transition engineering courses there, which all you need is one. It's kind of like safety engineering. Don't blow the failure limit, right? Figure out how you're going to change the system that you know. So let's imagine that we're all on a train, and we're going to call it the technical industrial enterprise. Right? This thing that we've built, and it's comfortable, and it's fast, and it's going to a bad place. So what are we going to do about it? We have to change the pathway. We have to change the direction we're going. We don't actually have time to change the train. Be cool. It would be if it would work. We don't have time to change the fuel right now. We have to change the direction. We have to slow down. We have to change the direction. How would we do that? What are the mechanisms for change? And you know what? A lot of them we don't actually know. So if you want to get into innovation, this would be the space to get into. How are we going to do that? Well, let's look at this a different way. Let's look at this as if the things we know, the systems we already know, we make them work, they run right, they're building them the way they're supposed to, and now they have to change. And again, with all three legs of the stool plus policy, it's going to be complex, it's going to be messy, but it's going to be pretty cool when we start making these changes and we can actually see that we're going in a better direction, and that direction is future safe and it's climate safe, and that's important.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that was a very high energy way to stimulate our thinking for the discussion. Again, do we stress things to the failure point, or which is the direction we've been heading in according to the science, or are we able to find innovative ways to bend the curve and to move in another direction? So now we have an opportunity to expand a little bit on those little tasters we got from our colleagues. And I'm going back online to Lata. Hi, she's back there. I'm going to ask a little bit on this question of facilitating academia and decision makers. And I'm wondering, because we are here on the road from COP26 towards COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and then on to COP28 in the UAE under their presidencies, how do we see and how do we facilitate academics influencing and engaging on that road from COP26 to COP27, COP28 and beyond? Over to you, Lata. We can't hear you, you're on mute.
Apologies. After 2 years, still occasionally on mute. Okay, so what we had that really made the facilitation work was that we had lots of buy-in from lots of different stakeholders. So if we go back to 2021 and we talk about the Futures We Want, the Visions project, it was a mix of representatives from government, civil society, businesses, and also a very good contribution from young people who wanted to put together this set of country or regional profiles. And so we were able to have very accurate information about GDP, trade flows, climate risks, the capacity for development, at the same time moving on into the energy transition, which is going to differ from country to country, and also the public opinions on a net zero future. And these were all really vital to streamline all of the unique issues from each region. And it also it enabled really clear messaging and a clearer set of recommended pathways towards a sustainable zero carbon future, so that policymakers could understand it, and it was really able to influence decisions at COP26. I think that it would be really ideal for more of these academic, business, government sort of triangle of different contributors to form these initiatives to develop in the coming years, so that we can really focus our thoughts quickly and accelerate all of the international policy discussions on climate. I think that it really doesn't work if there's only one group of people in the room together, and certainly it doesn't work if it's only one nation as well. We had UAE alongside KSA together with UK, Jamaica, Brazil, India and Kenya. So we really had a broad overview of different climate risks and different developmental problems that are going to be encountered if we try to make the transition. So I think everybody has to be in on the conversation.
It's really interesting to hear you say that there are two aspects there to not be single on, not to have only one group, so maybe not only one sector either, and not to have only one country. As we look forward, particularly to COP27, and we are looking, I think Egypt as the COP27 presidency is looking at a focus on agriculture, on water, on sustainable energy, just energy transition. What would your recommendation be that we could pass over to the incoming COP27 presidency to really bring in, or perhaps continue the futures we want, or build on the futures we want processes so that this can be taken forward?
I think that it would be really good to have more input from some of the countries that are going to be impacted very soon and very starkly by climate change. So the UK, perhaps we're a little bit luckier than other nations. We've got moderate fuel reserves, fossil fuel reserves. About 16% of our energy comes from nuclear power. 11 operational nuclear reactors. We've got a very large methane gas field, which powers 85% of our homes for heating and cooking and domestic hot water. And we have actually got very extensive offshore wind and onshore wind power, and we also have a reasonably high solar capacity for such a small and cloudy country. And I think it's really important for everybody to keep everything on the table. We have to investigate how we're going to improve the efficiency of the national grid and also microgrids, and we have to also consider what happens if you're a nation which has intermittent grid, or if you wish to have more intermittent grid. These really all have to be which goes to 85% of people's housing, and the drive to have hydrogen or another alternative fuel filling up those gas pipes instead of using it is very, very attractive because we've spent so much money on that infrastructure. It may not actually be the right solution, we don't know, but it's going to be very difficult to argue against it. Many nations have got these very unique problems. I think really taking an interest in different challenges that other countries have and different solutions that are slightly out of the box would be a good way to start.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great way to think about sharing the experience of other countries and also the individual circumstances in order to find solutions. I'm going to turn to Ludo now, and looking at that question of water and the different circumstances in which countries find themselves, and the kind of technology we're talking about for hydrogen, for example. We know, as well explained by a number of colleagues, what is required. Last week, we had the World Water Forum. And one of the things that was very clear from the World Water Forum is that globally, we do not have a systemic approach to the use of water. So we have water and sanitation projects, we have maritime issues, we have a variety of different elements to it. We care about the rivers in the sky, we think about different things, but we don't have a systemic element. So when we think about both the connectivity between renewable energy sources and using water to produce fuels, how can we balance those different elements in different countries? How do you take that forward?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think it's not only a challenging task, but it will be community dependent, country, region dependent. Some countries are very rich in water, but the water is not fit for production of hydrogen, for instance. In other cases, it might be close to be, to be suitable, but we still have to treat that anyhow. So I think that the technologies are there to manage this. We are good at producing food, and to make food, we need fresh water and the right nutrients. So this we have been mastering across the last 100 years or so. I think globally we are not too bad at that. But now making water at the scale and with a minimum energy input required in order to become competitive, to not just make expensive drinking water or bottled water potentially, but make it in such a way that we can have a sustainable route forward to generate hydrogen is a very different story. And obviously, like you mentioned, incorporating renewable energies like solar, wind farms, like in the UK and Scotland, for instance, and so on, is definitely a way forward. And I think there is not one solution. It has to be incorporated across the whole grid per se, and see how things move forward in that sense. But looking at the specific, maybe UAE example there, obviously we are beyond water's case. It doesn't rain here, So the water in the ground is fossil. Okay, when we extract water, it's not being replenished at all, or very, very, slowly. So if we extract water, we know that it will not last forever, like oil in a sense. So that's why desalination came as the most relevant, I think, solution to tackle the water scarcity issue in the UAE anyway. And so I think the country is very good at making that fresh water. And now the question is, how can we reduce that footprint? How can we utilize renewables? If we have to use hydrogen to feed the water desalination process itself, where does it stop? That's why, in my view anyway, and I think it's a consensus, is that hydrogen technologies are a transition. Okay, regardless if it's for coming from the blue hydrogen, from methane, or if it's moving forward more in the longer term on the green aspect, on the green hydrogen, this is going to be a transition to manage better our resources. That's really what I think is going to come up in that sense.
So in fact, what you could say when it comes to net zero is that hydrogen is not the net zero solution. It's a transition on the road.
Exactly right. I mean, at the end of the day, each process we implement has an efficiency, and it's not 100%. Maybe it's 50, maybe 55 or 60 if we are very good at it, okay? But it's rarely beyond 60%. So every time we have a process, we lose 35, 40% of energy in that process. So when we make hydrogen, we lose energy by making it in the first place, okay? And we don't have a choice maybe, or maybe we can look at how we combine energies to reduce that footprint and to reduce the emissions. That's the main thing. I think decarbonizing means not only getting to renewables, but making sure that whatever is being emitted is captured at the source. And that's where converting with the blue hydrogen, methane to hydrogen makes sense, because we don't actually have single source pollutions across the globe. We have maybe a single location or a few locations where we can actually capture, utilize, or recycle that CO2 as a resource, as opposed to being wasted in the atmosphere as it is right now.
Thank you very much. And I think I'm going to continue on the same vein with Adrian and wonder about the scale of hydrogen. What is the realistic scale of using hydrogen, even in that transition sense, at the moment?
Well, scale is one of the recognised challenges around hydrogen, and that comes about really from the ability to store hydrogen, which is it's a high energy sort of process, because you've got to have high pressurized storage facilities. So that's one of the aspects which makes hydrogen difficult. But it's interesting that industry already starts to tackle these problems, because we have an ecostructure which uses hydrogen. So in the industrial sector, actually much of the hydrogen that's used in industry is made on site. It's not shipped around. And we are likely to see a transition from this sort of centralized production of things to a distributed production of things as we move forward. And we're seeing it in our electricity generation. So at the moment we are seeing solar, wind being brought onto a grid, but the locations of those solar and wind, etc., are very different. And so we're likely to see a world that's very different in the energy transition, because we use a lot of energy in moving things around. There's safety, there's security of supply. It makes a lot more sense to make things locally. But the economics of many chemical production plants are such that you make them, you run them 24 hours a day, and you don't stop. So hydrogen is really interesting, because it's one of those products that's already highlighting some of the ways in which we might see transition occur. So localized production using local resources and clean electrons is a sustainable model, right? But it will be different depending on your locality. And that's what's fascinating. And so we're hearing debates around many different technologies and the potential applications and implementations, but really there's no one size fits all. You're going to have very different solutions in different locations. And so we talk about the production of hydrogen for our transport sector, and maybe in the future we'll have fuel cell powered cars alongside the battery powered vehicles. That's a kind of chicken and egg problem. We don't have, the reason that's mainly not sort of produced at the moment is that we don't have a hydrogen infrastructure to fuel our cars. We can buy a fuel cell car, but we can't drive it very far because there's not a hydrogen fuel station.
Yeah.
Right. So what do? Do you make the car and have no fuel, or do you make the fuel? So this is, it's all endemic in this process of transition. Most of us would say that you will have fuel cell powertrain in a car in the future. Electrical cars will have a definite role from batteries, but heavy vehicles, transportation across large distances, it's much more likely to be a fuel cell powertrain.
And that really demonstrates the strategic complexity for policymakers and for planners, for investors looking forward, for trying to game out all of these potential options. We talk a lot about the generation side of power. We don't often think about the transmission. It's an obvious element in that, and very often grids are old or they're in a different place, they need to be upgraded, they need to be changed. But if you're talking about significant elements of power being generated, as it were, on site or locally, without the need for transmission, then that also changes the calculations about the grid. It also changes the calculations about your tariffs and about the way you actually sell the power, if you like, or how that works. So there's a whole complexity into this element. So again, the question comes: to what extent do you think this process of hydrogen, which I think everybody thinks is going to be a bigger part of the economy than we see it now, can actually be part of a net zero solution, and in what time frame?
Time frame, I might duck, but in terms of hydrogen is interesting because we know that we're going to start to get intermittency of supply onto our electrical grid. We're going to have the sun shining and we're not going to be able to use the electrons. So what you have to do as an electricity supplier then is you have to pay someone to reduce the amount of electricity being generated. So that's a cost, immediate cost. We generate too many electrons, we can't use them. We can't store them easily by themselves. We have batteries, but batteries have a relatively limited capacity. The amount of electrons we need to store is very substantial. And so hydrogen is actually being proposed as a mass storage medium as well, in the sense that when we've got too much electricity, we can use the electrons and we can split water. And then we store hydrogen. Yes. And there are plenty of other chemicals that could do that. And so it's this move from the electricity grid is kind of driving this. We're moving from a system where we essentially know how much electricity is going into a grid to one where we really don't. And it's certainly not balanced in terms of need. And so hydrogen's a big part of that. And it's not seen in that way at the moment. It's not really seen as a battery. It's called a vector because it takes an energy from one place and moves it somewhere else. It doesn't necessarily store it as a battery does, but it has the capacity to store energy and then be used again. And that can be local, or it can be distributed around the ecostructure.
Which is a really interesting thought of a different way of using a gas which we already have, and it's already being produced. I'm going to turn to Professor Joe online and come back to, you just mentioned storage, carbon capture and storage. Now, sometimes this is quite controversial in debate because people worry that if we go hard over on the carbon capture and storage side of things, that will let the pressure off the producers of emissions to reduce their emissions, because they'll just say, well, we can buy an offset through carbon storage. Of course, the story is much more complicated than that. So what would you like to see it more broadly understood about the systems of carbon capture and storage? And indeed, if you want at all to touch on the question of carbon markets within that, that would be very helpful.
Thank you. question, carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture utilisation and storage, is a critically important component of the energy transition. I think we all recognise that we are in a climate and ecological emergency, and that we need to do something now or very shortly. And that will be one way in which we can actually move that curve towards a flatter dimension by capturing the carbon, storing it and utilising it. We are in a position now within the UK, within at least two of the clusters that we will be operational by 2025, early 2026, with the industrial scale carbon capture and storage. We already have some large carbon capture and utilisation facilities in place in the UK. We do need some more work around business models and the revenues and the incentives to enhance the commercial viability of carbon capture, utilisation and storage, but also hydrogen production as well. So something like a contracts for difference model around that, to ensure that the cost that it is at the moment for using methane with emissions is this. At the moment, the cost of doing maybe hydrogen production or carbon capture may be this. We need some kind of contracts for difference, some kind of business models to ensure that those are balanced. But then we also need, we've talked a lot about infrastructure, we also need the investment into these major facilities to enhance the commercial viability and the deployability of these particular projects.
And could you perhaps explain for some, or describe for some of us who haven't seen a carbon capture and storage facility, what does that really look like?
So a carbon capture facility is something that you would bolt on to a carbon emission facility. So something like an ammonia facility, for example, you would bolt onto that the carbon capture facility. You would then have a pipeline from that, which would lead towards probably an oil and gas field. In the case of a project that we're working on within HyNet, it would lead to an oil and gas field. And you would transition that oil and gas field from an extraction facility as it reaches the end of its life to then potentially a storage facility. So what is already a hydrocarbon store, you're transitioning it to a carbon store.
And what materials are used to do the storage?
It's the underground cavern that would otherwise store gas. You've extracted the gas and now you're storing carbon within it. So the underground reservoir.
No, but thank you for explaining those things, because at the end of the day, when it comes down to the simplicity of saying it's an underground storage of a place from which gas has been extracted into which we're reinserting gas, it's easier for people to relate to and not to think that it's some strange kind of technology that's going to be dangerous for them, or that is going to be something that is storing up trouble for the future. So if you look at one of those kind of storage facilities, what is the lifetime of it?
Millions of years. They've already been hydrocarbon stores for maybe 250 million years. So yeah, that sort of length of time.
Yeah. So there's a stability also in going down this road of carbon capture and storage.
Yes.
So what else needs to be done in order to scale up this kind of technology or this kind of usage to be a more viable or a more widespread element of the agenda?
Okay, so I think locally there needs to be more infrastructure put in place, so pipelines, compression units, etc. But this is a global agenda. We're in a global climate and ecological emergency. You're in the United Arab Emirates at the moment. There's lots of wells there where you could actually utilise those wells for carbon storage from other areas like North Africa, like other areas within the Middle East, capture the emissions and store them back in those wells. This is a global aspect.
Yes, I mean, in this region, we've heard a lot about the green initiatives, for example, the Saudi Green Initiative, the Middle East Green Initiative, the Great Green Wall, building natural carbon stores, if you like, through regenerating forests and green cover and green areas. So there are many different ways of finding carbon storage, actually, whether it's through a facility or whether it's through a more nature-based solution. So what you're suggesting also is that you could have a number of different modalities for storage, for carbon capture and storage around the world according to local requirements?
I am, yes. I'm also arguing that we are in a climate and ecological emergency. The major emitting hubs at the moment are industrial hubs. We have the technology there right now to capture those emissions and to store them. If we carry on emitting from those particular hubs at the rate we are doing at the moment, we may well reach that 1.5 degree tipping point sooner rather than later.
Are you optimistic that policymakers and investors are acting fast enough on this kind of solution to this particular emission problem?
Globally, no. Within the UK, yes. I am an eternal optimist about the way in which the UK government is absolutely leading on this agenda. Over the last 5 or 6 years, the policies coming out around carbon capture, the amazing policies coming out around hydrogen, fuel switching. Just today, the announcements from UK National Grid about the launch of a hydrogen-ready grid by 2030. I'm the eternal optimist around this. I think it's got a huge opportunity, but equally, I think it's got a huge opportunity for North Africa and for the UAE, particularly around the ammonia agenda, be that green or be that blue ammonia, and the opportunities to export to the UK and to other places as well. So I do think that there are substantial opportunities here for policymakers, for scientists, for innovation people to work between the UK, UAE and North Africa on this particular agenda.
Thank you very much. That's a very optimistic outlook on this particular technology solution to a very pressing issue. And I'm going to now turn to back to Alejandro and really say, look, when we talk a little bit more about sustainable aviation fuel, the fact is we have a lot of emissions that come from transportation, from shipping as well as aviation. Our global logistics and supply chains rely both on shipping and on aviation to move goods around. It requires the same for moving people around. And as you said in your earlier presentation, it will be a long, long time before we get to the point, if ever at this stage, maybe there'll be new technologies by then, that we are really able to have a totally sustainable aviation fuel that is different from the hydrocarbon-based fuels that we have now. So could you tell us a little bit more about what can be done to help progress the move towards a more sustainable aviation industry and the fuel requirements, and expand a little bit on what you said before?
Sure. I honestly think that we, as the flying public, need to actually pay for what it costs to fly. We are accustomed to paying a few dirhams or dollars or pounds and flying very cheaply across the world and not paying for the carbon footprint that we are generating. There are a number of airlines today that allow you to buy pay a few dollars extra for you to actually offset the emissions that you're generating while on that flight. I think that has to become mandatory. Today, most of the airlines and the industry itself is actually doing that on a voluntary basis, but we as humans are accustomed to not paying for how we use energy. We're not paying for the pollution that it generates. And so until we internalize those costs and assume them, because we have to actually build the infrastructure to capture the carbon. But today, who's going to pay for that? Maybe the governments are going to pay for that in some countries, but there needs to be a mechanism. And I think that policy has to play a very big role in pushing us towards that net zero future. And aviation is not the exception. Aviation can be an example.
I think it's a really important point that you make that echoes the fact that we say often that tackling climate impacts, taking climate action, is not only for governments. In fact, when we think about the scale of emissions, it's not governments that do emissions. there may be a lot of hot air that come out of governments, but it's not necessarily carbon emissions. So the emissions mostly come out of industry, out of agriculture, out of transport, and these emissions. And of course, when we have hydrocarbon producers, they're also users, and we are the users of the end users of all of these products. So we are complicit, if you like, in the emissions, and therefore there is a question of how do you balance out the costs of those emissions and the cost of remediation and reducing the emissions. And of course, these are very rarely popular things, because if you're asking people to pay more from something that they've already been having, it's a challenge. But then you can say the payment is either upfront here or it's somewhere else later, and it may be more expensive later. So the question of this a global policy for mandatory payment of the carbon footprint, for the carbon footprint that everybody uses, is basically what you're advocating.
I mean, the aviation industry, as well as the maritime industry, are already working, specifically for aviation. There's the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, CORSIA. And that has an offsetting scheme so that as countries that participate in the International Civil Aviation Organization, they must declare the emissions that they are producing, and then they have to, there has been a baseline that has been established, which are the emissions that happened in year 2019. And so any emissions above that level, so that the emissions have been capped, and it's through CORSIA that countries will have to go out and figure out a way of offsetting any emissions above that 2019 level. So policy is in place, policy is working, but I think to the point that has been made by many of our colleagues, we need to do that now. We can't think that this is coming sometime in the future. It's already here, and we're already late.
There is an urgency to it.
Yes.
And you explained very well in the presentation the role of UAE, for example, as a hub. And there are other hubs around the world who are either hubs for aviation or hubs for shipping and other logistical centers. And perhaps they play a special role, or a special policy or a special lead role in thinking, how do you tackle the issue of emissions? If you are a hub for aviation, it means that you are the provider of a lot of aviation fuel, for example, to that passing trade. And therefore, perhaps there is a special role that we can call on. Again, thinking of our journey towards COP27, our journey towards COP28, our journey even before COP28, we'll have the global stocktake on how well we're doing. Perhaps by then there's some track that we can take forward through the COP process.
I definitely believe so. I think that we need to also recognize, we were discussing just before the panel, that this is, and we were discussing it yesterday as well, this is a transition, and it won't happen overnight, right? So a country such as the UAE, which is one of the major oil producers and users of the world, will not stop using fossil fuels or producing them in the near future. And so we have to find a way, and even though the UAE is investing incredible amounts of money in decarbonizing or in reducing the carbon footprint of its fossil use, that should be happening across the board. Every country should be investing in this, but not every country is. And so, we have to work towards that transition, and you can't sit on a high chair and ask those oil-producing countries to stop producing oil and stop using it. That simply isn't going to happen. So we need to be realistic.
Well, I think right now we're asking them to produce more. So that goes as a flexible demand when it comes to these energy sources. And in fact, the very good point is still there that oil is produced and gas is produced because we need to use it. So while we need to use it, we still can clean up the production. We still can look at carbon capture options, but we should also be looking at cleaner solutions. I want to turn to Susan now and really look a little bit more at this. We've talked a lot about policies, plans, scientific solutions, technology, even science fiction that comes true. Maybe not entirely Star Trek or Star Wars, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We may have good intentions, and we have great ideas, we may have fantastic science and wonderful apparent solutions, but we're still in a climate crisis. We still have the urgency to bend that curve down. What is not happening to join up these wonderful solutions with reality?
Let's look at this another way. There's a top-down view of the world, which is, pretty much what we've been hearing. And then there's what's really happening on the ground. And if I could hope that we got something good out of COVID, it would be an evolutionary ability to understand the word essential, right? The airlines during COVID didn't stop. Nobody's saying stop producing fuel. Let's look at it a different way. Fossil fuel, especially oil, is the most important fuel humanity will ever have for the next 10,000 years. It is not in our purview to blow through it in 100. It's essential. During COVID, the airlines found out what essential meant, and they essentially got to that requirement. The airplane still flew. The airline, there weren't zero aircraft. The essential aircraft were in the air. The ships didn't stop moving around the planet. The essential goods kept moving around the planet. The cruise ships stopped. That wasn't essential, right? So that one idea that we hadn't actually ever had in our policy discussion or in our technology discussion becomes a central idea. Well, what's actually essential? What's essential to well-being? What's critical for health and safety? And the other things, like my granddaughter turned 1. 2050, she's going to be 30. 2050, we're talking about, well, if we want to, now I want to, all right? It's not an if. There's no if on if we want to not blow past 2 degrees C. No if for Granny. Anybody else a grandparent? It's like, no if, My grandkid in 2050 is going to need essential fossil fuels. The world is going to change to where fossil fuel is for essential stuff, and we rework the way we get our, our essential needs met. And if you don't know what that looks like, if you're thinking, I don't know what that looks like, well, have you looked? Try it. This is the innovation space. This is the opportunity space within which my fervent hope is that 100,000 engineers a year will become transition engineers and start looking in that space and saying, from the ground up, how do we change what we're doing right now? And there's so much innovation here. There's innovation in the way that the oil market works. The oil market is a 70-year-old dinosaur. We're talking about a very, very valuable material that, $150 a barrel, we found out we would still buy it at that price. It's so undervalued. It's valuable. Let's look at it as an extremely valuable material and see where that gets us. I am not a person who's going to say, I got solutions. I've figured out how to define problems in a way that I then get new ideas and innovations, and usually from the ground up. I start with what's important about that to you in that place. Water, kind of essential. So let's start with that in this place. Some other places, drainage because it rains so much, essential, right? So where I live in Scotland, it's too much water that's the problem. So yeah, just
so I would say when we
look at things a different way.
When we look at the region that we're now in, the Middle East and North Africa region, this is a climate hotspot. This is a place where the temperatures have already risen. where the sea temperatures have risen, the sea levels have risen, the salinity has risen, biodiversity has dropped, sea lines are being eroded, the mangroves are dying back. There is not enough water. I think I was told in Jordan, for example, there is available fresh water naturally for about 2.5 million people, and there are currently more than 11 million. It's really tough. So maybe in Amman, maybe the municipality delivers water once a week. And then after that, you buy it expensively from the water truck or something of this kind. Or maybe you just do without. It goes back to what you said about essential. But if we think about a global debate and we think about what is essential, we also find different things. Some people find it essential to be able to fly off on holiday. Some people don't have access to energy at all. If we take the continent of Africa as a whole, I think 640 million people currently don't even have any access to electricity. So we have different elements to this debate, and it's very good to think what is essential, what is not essential. How can energy needs be met in different ways, in different places, according to need, not necessarily just nice to have. And I think some of the solutions that we've heard about, especially the forward-looking, the uses of hydrogen, the uses of renewable energy to, for example, produce water or to meet our needs in other ways, in a decentralized sense, are also going to be able to start to meet the needs of communities who don't have the luxury to have the debate that we're having right now. So I think when I think about that, and we think about the wider question of equity, and if we take those wonderful development words from the Sustainable Development Agenda, which is leave no one behind, and we think as we look at our climate solutions, we want to leave no one behind, let alone start with the most behind first. Well, what is the role of science and academics and engineers in helping governments to think through? And that's going to be my last question to the panel. So, and then we'll see if we can take some questions from the floor. Where is that role in getting into the agenda to help governments to reach the parts that are not currently reached?
Start with getting the problem definitions right. Start with making sure that, again, that we're working on what's essential, and that we don't forget about the local. Don't forget that's where our problems actually are. I know that we've had this industrial revolution and we've become a top-down society, but that was fueled by copious amounts of fossil fuel. Now it's time for reinvention, for innovation. Not, okay, there's innovation for innovation's sake, right? For, you know, a new shape to the milk bottle. Oh, no. Innovation as in what we thought was going to work isn't going to work. What are we going to do? Right? Well, let's look at this another way. That sort of innovation. What are we actually going to do?
Okay. On which note, innovation, let us turn over to the audience and see if we have any brave questions. I see one here. Any more hands? Two. And I like the fact that it's ladies first. I'm unashamedly discriminatory in that sense. Could you say who you are and where you're from?
Sure. Hi. Thank you, everyone, for a very interesting discussion. My name is Dima Al-Srouri. I'm from the Sorbonne University in Abu Dhabi. I'm also founder of a boutique consultancy for sustainable development in Dubai. My question relates to a comment you mentioned about linking water and energy. And I think it's a really interesting idea. But then if we really need water to produce energy or energy to produce water, aren't we creating codependencies that will put us at even more risk in the future and will make us less resilient? Or like, should we actually separate them to be more resilient, or should we link them to move forward more into more systematic thinking? What are the cons and pros of both approaches?
Thank you very much. Can I turn to Adrian, perhaps?
I was thinking Ludo actually
Ludo?
might be with the water.
Yeah.
Start off and then.
It's a very good point, and I think there are different facets to that aspect, obviously. the water demand in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, or in most arid countries will only grow, obviously, from population growth, more needs on the agriculture aspect and industry. So we know that we're going to have to cater for more important needs very soon. And that's why the government has these policies or these roadmaps for water production by, I think, 2051 is one for water defined by the UAE government. Now, obviously, we take a risk if we utilize that resource, which we are aiming initially for a specific target, and divert that resource to produce energy in that sense. That's very true. And I think as long as we can ensure that we look at alternative water sources, okay, and one of them is potentially atmospheric water capture, which is not cheap to make, for sure, but which can help reduce the balance or balance things out in areas where it's not cost effective to bring the water in the first place, maybe, because of shipping, because of piping, because small volumes to be delivered for farms in the countryside, you know, in the desert of Abu Dhabi, for instance, we can manage to cater for some of these needs in that sense. Now, moving down to the energy aspect, obviously it has to be coupled to our renewable energy schemes. And at the same time as we consume water for energy production, we need to make sure we balance the water production, we increase that somehow in order to make sure that we are not, it's not becoming detrimental to the rest of the community and to the other needs per se. And maybe beyond that, on the policy aspect, we have to save more water. I mean, the UAE are one of the countries, we use one of the highest level of water per capita per se. So we can do better as a community, I'm sure. And I mean, I'm French of background, but I spent 15 years in Australia. And when the draft came in 2007, we could not actually get water to water anything outside. I mean, that's the first thing we cut, you know? And there is a level of essential or needs there which we have to think about. Do we want to have green spaces? Yep, probably. Can we afford it? Maybe right now. And how do we make sure we can still afford it in 5-10 years time? So that's my message. I think obviously it's not only about can we make more water? Can we use it for energy? Yes, we can. But how do we make sure that the water we produce is used in a wise manner? And that, of course, we reduce the cost in terms of energy, not money, energy cost per liter of water. And we can still do better in that aspect, I think.
I have to believe that overall the amount of water within the global system does not change, but it may just end up being in the wrong place or in the wrong form.
I think maybe I have a number wrong, but there is about 500,000 cubic kilometers of water evaporated every year going to the atmosphere and back as a cycle. So it's a huge amount of water we have in the air. Okay? And in humid regions like the UAE, we can definitely tap into that and try to make it. But you're right, the amount of water is pretty much the same. If we split water to make hydrogen, maybe we actually, it's a fossil resource in that case, but water is produced in other ways. And when we use hydrogen with oxygen in the reactor or in the engine, we produce water again. So that balance is fairly stable, for sure.
It's certainly true that there can be unforeseen consequences to significant changes that we do. And again, going back to the World Water Forum last week, it was clear that there are a lot of questions around the systemic use of water. And we see, for example, I talked before about the rivers in the air, the movement of water through the air that we don't think about, but we depend upon. When do the rains come? Maybe not here, but when do the rains arrive? Do they arrive at the same? We've a lot of evidence showing that the traditional rains, are not arriving in places at the same time that they used to. They're either earlier or later, or they're sporadic, or there's too much at the same time, and we get unexpected flooding. So the potential unanticipated consequences of big changes that we make as humans through technology can also be something that we need to keep an eye on. Because otherwise we could create, whether it's a codependencies or unexpected circumstances. So I think we had another question here.
Yes, hello. Firstly, thank you for your talks. I have two little questions.
Where are you from?
I'm from the UK, but I'm based in Riyadh at the moment.
Okay.
And I'm working in public health research at the intersection of climate and health. I think my first question would be, when will scientists be taken seriously? The latest IPCC report is the starkest yet, and governments are still hypocrites. The UK government is one of the biggest historical contributors. They have massive climate debt, and they are still approving new oil fields, even though the International Energy Agency say there's no room for new oil and gas. So yeah, when will governments actually listen? carbon footprinting is an advertising tactic from BP to shift the blame to personal impact, but like we can do everything right and we're still nowhere near meeting targets with all these big net zero goals of greenwashing, if that makes sense.
So what can science do to help governments to make good decisions, to pay attention to the findings of global science reports, communicate them in a way that enables good policymaking and decision, and can be supported by the public?
Okay, I mean, scientists are a sort of strange breed, not always easy to listen to. I think, not talking about the industrial sector, but if you think about something we've all been through, which is COVID. In the UK, we had a daily briefing where the chief scientific officer stood next to the government and produced a report detailing advising cases, all these different things, and people sat and listened. And I think that one of the things that came out of COVID was very clearly that science does have a role. The politicians, they still make the decision because that's their job. But the scientists need to be able to provide the information in a way that everybody can access. And so I think there is a challenge for scientists because we're not always that accessible, right? And we don't always necessarily communicate in a way that's useful to make decisions because there are many different opinions. And so I think there's a lot to be done around that communication of science across society and trying to emphasize that science can provide solutions and can have a big impact on our life. And so maybe COVID is an interesting example of scientists being very close to the front of those highlighting of the challenges and actually being seen as providing solutions, providing vaccines and providing an opportunity for us to perhaps emerge from in another emergency, if you like, in a way that we may not have expected to do. So I'm kind of more optimistic as a scientist than I was, in the sense that I think people maybe will listen to scientists more and will be bringing more scientific input into the decision-making process around climate change. It's a hope.
Anybody else from the panel like to add anything on that one? Susan?
Well, if we, again, look at it another way, there definitely was, like you say, the science advisors there, but in every school, the people in that school had to figure out what they were going to do, how they were going to do it. And in every shop and in every, there's this sort of top-down view of things. And then you have to actually do something today that protects your people, that, we saw so much innovation, at least we did. I spent the pandemic in New Zealand. And the innovation around, we all know about online communications now that we didn't use before, but businesses innovating how they were going to do business, right? They can't do it the way they were anymore, so they're going to figure out a safe way to do it, and they would just get on with it. And so that the role of science telling us that we're crashing into a failure of our industrial technical enterprise on this planet, I don't know, maybe we haven't got that message quite right, so we could work on that. But again, turning it around and saying, okay, problem definition then. What is it that I, in my school, in my neighborhood, in my shop, what does it mean to me as an airline, as an oil producer? And just turn loose some people to sit in a corner for a minute and say, well, what would that mean to us? Just take some think space, take some innovation space. Maybe it'll turn into opportunity space. I'm pretty sure it will, because that's where I've been for 10 years. It just happens. If you don't try to solve a problem, if you won't define it, which COVID, that's what the science was doing. It was giving us a very clear definition of the problem. But then there's hundreds of thousands of adaptations, innovations, problem solving at all levels of society that went on. So that clear definition, and maybe we're not getting that clear definition. Maybe it's couched in too much, if we want to save the planet, or I don't know. Yeah.
The conditionalities. I'm conscious that we've got two panel members online as well, and I wonder if Joe or Lata would like to put your hand up. Joe, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. Following on from the previous comment, really, I think it's up to us scientists to provide the evidence and to come up with solutions to some of these challenges. They may well be a plethora of different solutions, a spectrum of different solutions. But what I see as being science and innovation with impact, and that's very much what the UK's Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre has been set up to do. How can we go about coming up with some of those solutions? How can we reduce the costs of those solutions? Can we mitigate the risks associated with them, reduce the risks, if you will? How can we reduce the sort of timelines for the adaptation and the adoption of those particular technologies? How do we reduce the emissions? We're in a climate and ecological emergency. We've got to do something, and we need to do it now.
Thank you. Were you also putting your hand up, Lata? We've got a very bad line. We've got a very bad line there. I don't think you're on mute, but we're not hearing you. That's just frozen. Now you're frozen.
Bad line.
Maybe turn the. I think it's the bandwidth.
Can anybody hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Try again.
Okay, I don't know how long my video is going to last, but in the UK we have a nascent low carbon energy landscape that's being built up. So we've started to get onshore, offshore wind. We're talking about hydrogen, microgrids, and national grid as well. And we have a skills gap in good graduates who have a diverse science, technology, and policy background. And we really need them to know about integrated energy systems, not just one big centralized energy system. I would really like, all nations to really focus on what kind of future employees you really need to be able to drive, redeployment of your current fossil fuel sector working people into a very, it could be a very innovative, lucrative, and highly broad and well-rounded future nascent low carbon energy landscape. And every country needs one because everybody's going through the energy transition, and we've got to generate people and we've got to import people. So I think science's role is really, as well as doing the research, education is just the next thing that needs to be done to close this global skills gap for the future.
I think that's an extremely important point. Generating the skills that we need to be able to innovate and take this forward is, of course, also, it's not just research and development, it's also the education and the skills development that all of you are involved in. And I think that requires a very close coordination, both with government and with industry and with the private sector more generally, to understand those skills requirements and to redesign curricula accordingly. I'm looking around the room to see if we have another question here. Any more after that? Another one here and another one at the back.
Julian Smith from Rothamsted Research in the UK. So from a parallel sector, agriculture, so not energy. To what extent do we think the situation we have now is a market failure of policy, or driven by policy or a lack of policy? 10 years ago, there was a major government science review on farming systems, global farming systems, which sort of concluded, in the end of that major survey on sustainability and resilience of agriculture, with lots of graphs that went up and down. I asked the question, do we believe that the market forces, the commercial sector, can take responsibility for a sustainable food supply chain into the UK? And the feedback from the panel, people like yourselves now, experts in their fields, said yes. 10 years on, which seemed a long time when I asked that question, is now, and it clearly hasn't worked. The supply chains of the supermarkets are even more selfishly driven than ever before, and sustainability is given lip service in a majority of cases. So, do we need to be more interventionary with our policies? You look at COVID and the extent to which the government has intervened in that and been brave to intervene in that area? Are there lessons to learn from that that we want to take forward into other sectors? So I think of technology as a researcher, and we put funding, we prime research at the early stage, where we match a university fund with an industry fund, and we get some good at science started, and then we abandon it, and it fails to scale. So if I think of something like insect protein, that's quite an exciting piece of science, but the market price for insect protein isn't commercial when we try to scale it, and we're not getting any sort of guarantee for a market from the government to enable industry to de-risk that next stage. So policy is trying to de-risk the initial innovation stage, but not providing a guaranteed market for a product. And I guess that's probably parallel there with energy as well. If we go back to COVID, the thing that really worked with COVID was that the government guaranteed that all those vaccines would be bought at a guaranteed price, and then they probably funded the research a little bit as well, but they didn't need to fund the research then. The industry flew, and they did a great job, and we had COVID vaccines. How do we get these energy sectors? How do we bridge that sector between early research and scale products, where so many good ideas fail? And is there a role for government there to give a market guarantee for an energy, whatever that might be?
So I guess if I can summarize that, it's a kind of, what is the role of government de-risking some of these innovative policies that are not otherwise yet attractive enough for market and investment, or for the general public to make insects part of their daily life, for example. It doesn't sound good, does it? Although I think it's great for
lots of
pets.
technologies.
But no, but I mean, it's the sort of,
well, we're not really an agriculture panel, but in energy context, there is no forward scenario in which we can achieve the targets without a big efficiency gain and demand reduction. And so I would say that a government policy that allows companies to make money from demand reduction, it actually worked in California during the 1980s and 90s energy crisis there. So look to where there's examples that do work. I know there's always lip service given to efficiency and conservation, but turn the market loose on that. The other thing we should probably just ask ourselves is, could neoliberal economics be wrong?
There's a big question. I think that's a question for another panel. Does anybody else, or anybody, or either of you online, like to take up that question of the question of the policy end of de-risking? I would say de-risking innovation and introducing into the market, whether it's agriculture or something else.
Yeah, so I'll take that question. I think there's a pressing need for governments per se to consider the revenues and incentives to support innovation. I think that's a real opportunity, and I think it's a real opportunity there then if you get the revenues incentives right to attract international investment to support that even further. But if I could just reflect very quickly upon the question came from someone who was engaged with agriculture and food. Within the UK at the moment, we've got a significant challenge because our fertiliser is switched off because it's too expensive to get feedstocks. What does that mean in terms of us being able to feed ourselves in the future? Just an open-ended question, just a comment, not to be answered now, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think we have one last question, unless anybody else puts a hand up.
Hi, everyone. David from HSBC Sustainability Team in the region. It's great to see so much talk about innovation and all of those technological solutions that need to come our way to solve the crisis that we are on. I cannot help thinking, however, that isn't that a double-sided knife, that it might just lead some people to believe, oh, scientists will come and just solve everything when we are at 4 degrees. And then we don't have to worry, we just continue business as usual and continue emitting CO2. Or maybe it's that this innovation should have happened 20 years ago, so it's actually ready to be deployed now when it's actually an emergency situation and has to be deployed in 2-5 years. More of an open reflection maybe than a question to anybody else in the panel, but
That's a very good point.
It's a very good point, because, and it goes to some of the points we were making before about the lead time in scaling up and getting innovations going. So again, how do we have anybody who would like to reflect on that one?
Well, the landscape is complex that we're in, and we can't discount the fact that we are humans, and we have these amazing capacities to create our own story. We always have. It's part of how we socialize and how we cooperate, how we get together, how we agree what we're going to do. And so you're right. If there's a narrative that is continuously conditioned, that don't worry, science will solve it. Do you actually mean science? I mean, it's all kind of engineering. So you aren't even saying the right thing. Then is that a real story? I don't know. And like you say, if it was going to work, well, wouldn't it have had to have been started 20 years ago? Or so questioning the narrative is actually what you're asking. You're asking, shouldn't we question the narrative? And like I said, as a serial innovator, that's what I would do.
Mm-hmm. Lata, were you putting your hand up online?
Yes, a very quick comment. In early 2019, the Committee on Climate Change, which is an independent organisation which advises the UK government, they produced a brilliant report about practical recommendations on how the UK can get to net zero. The main comments they had were that to get to net zero without legislating hard, we really need some disruptive innovation. We really need some new technologies to come in and sweep the need for fossil fuels. It will seem like it's an easy pathway. And then the other option, which was that we have to legislate hard, and we can probably get to 1.5 degrees and not above with technology that exists today. But that would rely on governments having to really prioritise climate over every other thing a government prioritises. And no government is prepared to do that. So we have to really hedge our bets on demand side behavioural change, and also waiting for a good technology or accelerating good technologies. And they also said downplay the role of investment. So, for example, recently in the UK, the cost of offshore wind really dropped dramatically. It's now extremely cheap per kilowatt hour to buy offshore wind power. And I think even 4 or 5 years ago, it was considered to be a poor investment, but it's really, things can change in 1 or 2 years at the moment, looking at how urgent and stark our climate issues are. So we have to include all of these things, but it is worth remembering that legislating hard is an option. It certainly happened with COVID, and it could happen with climate change as well.
I think that's a very interesting note on which to finish, and I would just note that back in 2015, climate was recognised as a rights issue for the first time. And that means that it has an impact on many other things, whether it's water security, food security, energy, education, healthcare, the whole raft of elements. So it's very hard to legislate for one thing without having an impact on everything else. The great interconnectedness of things. On which note, I'm going to invite His Excellency up to give us some closing reflections, having sat patiently through our panel today. Patrick.
Not patiently, interestedly,
Yes.
if that's the word. Look, first I just want to say thank you, Janet, and to all the panel for and to everyone here for what was a really fascinating discussion. I fear to venture in when there's been so much wisdom and interesting ideas spread, but I think talked about. But I think I'll go back to sort of where we started at the beginning. Where we are. This isn't something science can solve on its own. It's not something governments can solve on its own. It's not something we as individuals can do on our own. It is a combined effort. So what I took, on the optimistic side is just how much stuff is going on in the scientific world. I think we're all getting better at understanding the science, and we need to reach out to scientists as much as you reach out to us. COVID was a good lesson in that. I think it's interesting how quickly we move from science into actually discussing the intersection of science and policy, or the intersection of science and business, or the intersection of all three. Then add in our own human behaviour. I think Susan, you covered quite a lot of that, and you have some sense of a complexity. There aren't easy answers, but I think we saw a lot of the drive, energy, and reason for optimism in the discussion today. And 3 cheers for scientists, but we all need to be pulling in the same direction and learning how to bring that to bear. So, but a huge thank you to everyone for your time. This is the right subject to be talking about, and it's a privilege to listen to all of your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think it remains to me, after thanking Patrick, His Excellency, for winding it up for us, to thank Joe and Lata online, to thank Susan, Alejandro, Adrian, and Ludo here with us in the room, and you yourselves for a great panel and an interesting discussion. Thank you very much.